This food as medicine concept needed to be brought forth into the world. People needed to understand the power at the end of their fork that they could use to feel better.
From the offices of the Weill Cornell Medicine Brain and Spine Center in New York City, this is Your Brain with Dr. Phil Steig. Internationally renowned scientist and researcher, Dr. Phil Steig is neurosurgeon-in-chief of the New York Presbyterian Weill Cornell Medical Center. This week, Dr. Steig and his guest explore nutritional psychiatry.
Hello, I'd like to welcome Dr. Naidoo, founder and director of the Nutritional and Metabolic Psychiatry Department at Massachusetts General Hospital. Good nutrition is about much more than weight loss, fitness, or longevity. In her book, This Is Your Brain on Food, Dr. Naidoo clearly explains the gut-brain relationship and provides straightforward diet recommendations. Dr. Naidoo, thank you for being with us today.
Thanks for inviting me.
For those of us that this is all a new subject, can you really explain to us what the concept of nutritional psychiatry is?
Yes. So nutritional psychiatry is the use of healthy whole foods and nutrients to improve our mental well-being based on the current scientific evidence. It does not exclude the use of therapy or medications. In fact, it's really meant to work in symphony with one another. And I think that is very important for people to understand.
When you go out and give talks, is there a surprise reaction by the connection between food and mental health?
I think the aha for people is that food actually does impact your mental health. Because most people, especially in the United States, think about food in terms of their waistline or type 2 diabetes or other things like that.
I think your book beautifully laid it out. You don't have to read it from page 1 to page 200 and whatever. You can take chapters out depending upon where you are in the brain health spectrum. And I think that's great. In your first chapter, I love the term gut-brain romance. For the layperson like me, can you explain what is the process that's going on in this romance?
The gut-brain romance is interesting because the gut and brain are kind of like, a couple. And in a relationship, there are good days and bad days. And that was why I used the words romance. It's not always romantic. But it is this way also in relation to food. The gut and brain originate from the exact same cells in the embryo. Then they divide apart to form the two organs, the gut and the brain. Then they're connected throughout life by the vagus nerve, which acts like this connector, this two-way superhighway between the two organs. Very simply, on a day that you eat a healthier meal, the breakdown products of digestion are healthy for the gut and the gut microbes, and they are healthy for the brain. On a day that you're heading to the fast food restaurants, the highly sugared, highly processed, ultra-processed junk foods and fast foods and other foods that are not healthy for our brain, their breakdown products are more toxic to the gut and the gut microbiome, and they start to set up for inflammation. And those more toxic products are sort of a bad day in the romance because you start setting up for inflammation. And what they start to do is damage the layer that lines the gut. And ultimately, over time, if that's the diet that you persist on eating, it leads to things like what is often called leaky gut or intestinal permeability. So that just sort of breaks down that, there are the good days and the bad days in the romance.
It's funny because I know that when I'm cheating in my diet, there are certain restaurants that I can go to, and I know the next morning I just wake up slow. I don't have the same energy levels, and it's exactly that interaction that occurs very quickly and affects you.
It's true. And things like stress can actually start to evolve and change the microbes within 2 hours of that stress impacting you.
You state that your goal is to show us how we can integrate diet with better mental health, but you make the comment that what works for the group, which is the group studies and the scientific data that you provide, doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to work for Phil Steig. And that's an important comment. There's a little bit of trial by error in this,
Yes,
correct?
That is correct. And part of that is related to the uniqueness of the gut microbiome. We really are thinking, and the science is showing us that it is incredibly unique, like a thumbprint for every one of us. I often will say, every healthy food is not healthy for everyone because our body responds differently. And so you're absolutely right. It is highly nuanced, and not everything in a group study is going to work for that individual.
Today, I wanted to focus on some of the more common things that I'm sure you as a psychiatrist and many psychologists have to deal with. Obviously, the most common thing is depression. Clinically, what does that mean to you when you say somebody has the diagnosis of depression? And then what are they doing from a diet standpoint that they should start avoiding?
Very often with depression, some of the nuances are things that people don't realize. They may be eating a sandwich for lunch and thinking that they're getting a low-fat deli meat. But, some of the more processed packaged meats and cheeses are loaded with nitrates and actually have been shown to worsen depression. So it starts off by thinking about how a person is eating. They might have heard that yogurt was healthy, but they're eating a fruited blueberry yogurt. And although blueberries on their own are healthy, the fruited yogurt in a half a cup serving could have 24 grams of sugar. So it's very important for them to understand that they have options and that they can be better versions of what they're eating. So they can have yogurt, just have a plain yogurt, add the berries, but avoid those loaded sugars that are added in to things like fruited yogurts. Sometimes people are really making an effort, but they don't realize the big impact of the small things, like those added refined sugars, which affect the body and the brain most importantly.
So in depression, high carbohydrate, high sugar content is one of the major things that an individual should avoid?
Correct. So I wouldn't want them to avoid all carbohydrates. I'm really talking about the highly processed, refined grains and things like processed sliced bread, tons of pasta. No one's saying don't eat pasta, just eat it in moderation. Things, like baked goods or daily donut that have highly refined sugars, simple carbohydrates, lots of sodas, foods that have high fructose corn syrup, but also artificial sweeteners. Aspartame is pretty harmful in depression, saccharin, sucralose, and even stevia. These are things that someone has to be really careful of to cut back on.
Do you have any advice for individuals when they go through the grocery store? They always say avoid the aisle with the freezer in it. It's really hard to find things that don't have a lot of sugar and carbohydrates and, even cereals. You think you're doing the right thing and you're not. Any advice?
Firstly, I think we have to advocate for ourselves. We have to understand food labels a little bit. For example, I've seen many moms misunderstand a food label because of how a cereal is said to be whole grain or whole wheat. But actually, it's the last ingredient, it's the least amount, and it's actually highly sugared. This trickery is something we need to take onus upon ourselves to understand a little bit by looking at the amount of sugar, looking at the actual whole grains of fiber in the content of the food. The whole point about the produce section is that vegetables and fruit, as well as beans, nuts, seeds, legumes, all contain fiber, and we desperately need that in our diet because some large database studies have shown that only 1 in 10 Americans eat enough of their vegetables and fruit, and that's our biggest source of fiber. So, lean into the colors, the textures, try out different flavors. And also, the other thing that you can do is think about if you don't want to spend the time cleaning and prepping the vegetables, go to the frozen section, but for frozen veggies, not frozen foods and frozen pizza, but frozen veggies are actually an economical way to get them. They will last longer and they're flash frozen. So unless they have sauce or sodium or syrup, they're actually pretty healthy.
There's a spectrum, I'm sure, between clinical depression where you feel that you need to provide medication, but also appropriate depression. I lose a loved one. And I know that. I feel just kind of down because something bad happened. Can I go eat something? And what are those things that I should look for to eat to help me feel less depressed?
So, like I said, one of the things we want to think about is we want to take away a habit that you might have been leaning on when you weren't feeling good. Maybe it was a tub of ice cream in the evening. Maybe it was having too many glasses of wine in the evening. Start there and then start to add in foods like those rich, colorful vegetables. Things like leafy greens actually are rich in folate. Low folate levels associated with depression. Things like omega-3 fatty acids. So fatty fish like salmon, wild sockeye salmon, anchovies, sardines, but also walnuts, flax seeds have omega-3s, the short chain omega-3s in them.
Can you do it from the nutrition segment of the drugstore? Go buy omega-3, go buy folate and yada, yada, yada. It's not as pleasant, but can you do it that way?
It's not ideal. I'm much more of a food first person, and let me explain why. When you eat the spinach, the arugula, the leafy greens, you're also getting the other nutrients and you're getting the fiber. Fiber is important for our gut. Remember the gut brain romance? It's the good food that helps along that romance. So there is a place for supplements. For example, saffron has a good amount of evidence with helping depression, but we can't eat enough of it. The clinical trials used much higher doses of saffron because they used a supplement. That's an example of where a supplement could be helpful. But for the most part, a lot of the other foods, I would suggest trying food first. But if you say you don't like seafood and you don't eat it for that reason, you can always look at getting a supplement because it's certainly going to be helpful.
I live in New York. Anxiety levels are always high, even on a good day. What's going on with anxiety? Number one. And number two, what can we eat to reduce our anxiety levels, or at least not to enhance the external causes of anxiety?
For one thing, I think that anxiety it's an emotion, it's a feeling, it's certainly a clinical diagnosis and all of that. But a lot of people in these times may not meet the criteria so-called for anxiety, but are just feeling very unsettled, worried, concerned. I think that, again, we start with things like caffeine. Are you drinking too many cups of coffee a day? Are you leaning into diet soda because the artificial sweeteners are disrupting your gut and are probably driving your anxiety? Are you including fiber-rich foods in your diet? This is where you can really help yourself. Fiber-rich foods break down slowly in the body. So think beans, legumes, lentils, broccoli, Brussels sprouts, any one of those. But high fiber foods will help you keep your blood sugar on an even keel and keep you on an even keel. Fermented foods. Great idea to add fermented foods in your diet because things like kombucha, miso, tempeh, sauerkraut can actually help with inflammation in the gut. And a very important study showed the fact that eating fermented foods lowers inflammation. So fermented foods is another one. And then spices. Spices like turmeric with a pinch of black pepper will really help you with anxiety over time if you just slowly incorporate just a little bit into your diet every single day. So a quarter teaspoon of turmeric with a pinch of black pepper to make it more bioactive and bioavailable to your body will help you over time, and add it to a soup, a smoothie, or a tea if you don't cook.
For me, spices make me anxious, so I stay away from them. You're a psychiatrist, and I think that I wouldn't want to lead the listeners down the pathway that, I'm depressed or I've got an anxiety disorder. I'm going to cure myself with a diet. For you, when do you start with medication? What's that dividing line between, being symptomatic to the point they need medication versus when you say, I think we can fix this with diet?
That's a very important question because, as I mentioned, I still prescribe medications. And, when someone's acutely ill, suicidal, severely depressed, unable to get out of bed, or losing touch with reality, this is a time where they might need an emergency hospitalization and really active treatment. It's really individuals who are coping, who are functioning, but not feeling as well as they could be. Talking about brain fog. They're still able to get to work, whether it's virtual or in person, but they are struggling to get the tasks done. So they're getting by, but they wish they could be more effective. That's a great example of someone who might be able to use dietary interventions immediately. Sometimes we start with a combination of medications. They may be on a medication, and over time, as the dietary changes kicked in and they're feeling better, we might be able to work with their prescriber to lower the medication or adjust that. And that happens quite a lot as well. So sometimes it's a combination, sometimes it's dietary interventions only, but much of that depends on the clinical evaluation that they are otherwise safe, that they are functioning okay, and can tolerate working on these dietary changes. In other words, they have to have the energy to implement the changes.
Throughout the book, you list what's bad for you food-wise and what's good for you for each one of the disorders that you focus on. And it seemed to me that in every chapter, you always said the bad thing was the American diet.
So, the Western diet, or the standard American diet, is really high in the wrong types of fats, trans fats that go into shelf-stable baked goods and cookies and breads that are shelf-stable, highly refined flours. Remember, you don't have to give these up immediately. You may not have to give them up at all, but you want to eat them in moderation. You don't want to lean on those packaged processed foods. It's the main source of your nutrition. Things like added and refined sugar are found in most foods, often in savory foods. So, ketchup, salad dressing, pasta sauces that are store bought often have a ton of sugar and we don't realize it. That's where we have to be savvy about food labels. Artificial sweetness in those diet sodas or foods labeled as sugar-free or low sugar are important because they can worsen our symptoms, especially in mental health. And then processed refined vegetable oils, so soy, corn, those types of things are really often used in fast food restaurants and certain restaurants because they're more cost effective. But they are pro-inflammatory to the gut, and we want to be careful around them.
These days, from the highly detailed packaged food labels to the calorie counts in restaurant menus, we have many tools that can help us be careful about what we eat. But is there such a thing as being too careful? Researchers are starting to pay attention to an emerging eating disorder called orthorexia nervosa, an unhealthy focus on healthy eating. It can have the opposite of its intended effect, leading to malnutrition and dangerous weight loss instead of improved health.
Excuse me, waiter, is your egg salad option guaranteed to be completely vegetarian?
Unlike the better-known eating disorder anorexia nervosa, where sufferers try to limit all foods, orthorexia is an overwhelming obsession with eating only good, healthy, and pure foods. When the health and purity of someone's food becomes the only topic of conversation, an obsession even, that's when orthorexia may be suspected. Although it's not an officially designated mental health diagnosis, experts are still debating the diagnostic criteria. Orthorexia may be experienced at one time or another by nearly 5% of American adults. Therapists who study this strange phenomenon have described not only malnutrition and other physical effects, but also emotional consequences when someone can't live up to the self-imposed purity ideals. They also note that while those with anorexia usually hide their eating issues, people with orthorexia tend to be open about them. They may even try to recruit others to their way of eating.
Yeah. And then, as soon as I decided to do only green vegetables and almond milk, I could immediately feel the toxins leaving my body.
Orthorexia may start as a healthy concern for one's diet, but can spiral down in a pattern of obsessive thoughts and destructive behaviors. It can often lead to social isolation, as fewer people can share the sufferer's increasingly restricted palate.
You know, there's nothing on this menu I can eat. I guess I'll just have to go home.
Treatment for orthorexia is a slow, gradual process of reintroducing foods that had been a cause of fear and anxiety. Patients eventually learn that one need not obsess over a meal to enjoy it.
Throughout the book, I was impressed with just the undertone of basically the individual has to be proactive. This stuff doesn't just happen on its own, and the brain needs energy, so it's going to want to eat and feed the body and feed itself. But give us advice on how or what measures you take and recommend to your patients on being proactive regarding a healthy diet.
What I find, in all honesty, is that people come to me because they want to tweak something in their diets. They come to me for the nutritional psychiatry advice. So that is an advantage to me because they come in with some motivation or some awareness that there's an issue. But then I ask them to start with one thing that they want to change, that they've identified as a problem and that they want to change, because what I find is that that usually works the best. And that the moment they start to feel better changing or tweaking that one habit, sometimes it's a matter of days before I get an email. I'm sleeping better. I have more energy today. I'm not saying that everything happens that fast, but some of it is the psychological viewpoint is, you're really working to almost improve your own health. And that is motivating to you. What I do find is when a person starts to feel better, they want to do more. They want to do so much more. And that is often a path that we go down together. and they feeling motivated because they either start to lose weight, or they can concentrate better at work, or they're sleeping better.
Can you maybe highlight an example of where you met a patient, recommended a diet change, and all of a sudden their life was transformed?
Well, it happened early on in my career that kind of pushed me in this direction. Patient kind of came in and yelled at me. I was a very timid resident at the time, and he said, you prescribe Prozac and you caused me to gain weight. And I knew from looking at the chart, looking at the medical record, that it wasn't me, and we had his baseline weight. But he also was carrying this very large 20-ounce cup of Dunkin' Donuts coffee, which everyone drinks in Boston. And I said, well, what did you put in your coffee today? And so he told me, and it ended up being a quarter or more of a cup of processed creamer and about 8 teaspoons of sugar. So I sat down at the computer and we calculated the number of calories he was consuming. Now, I don't feel calorie counting is the be-all and end-all of the nutritional science, but it's one aspect. And I proved to him that he was consuming so many empty calories, the sugar, the processed creamer, that, his eyes lit up. And that really was my aha moment, because he felt, you're telling me something that I can change. I'm drinking this seamlessly every day, but also mindlessly, and just consuming all these empty calories. Then that's even before I have my breakfast. When we worked together, it ended up being a really good, effective, and therapeutic relationship. He stopped yelling, started working with me much more effectively. We cleaned up little things in his diet, starting off right there with a cup of coffee. He lost weight over time. It was gradual. We didn't need to increase his dose of Prozac. He was able to stay on a pretty low dose. He felt a lot better when he lost the weight. The medications kicked in and his dietary changes kicked in. And I realized the power of working with someone when they feel that they can advocate for their own health and make the changes.
So let's maybe wrap this up with a little bit of talk about the ever-present subject of libido. And I thought it was good that you dispelled many of the facts about aphrodisiacs like oysters. You've ruined the Valentine's business with strawberries. In Italy, they always talk about sea urchins, and then there's rhinoceros tusk. What can you tell us about some of the things going around about aphrodisiacs?
So it's interesting because, foods that boost oxytocin is sort of that hugging hormone, include foods that actually could be on a Valentine's Day list, like dark chocolate. But it's the extra dark chocolate. It's not the candy bars we used to. Some magnesium and essential acids are found in certain foods, like certain meats, certain vegetables, etc. And then nuts are a good one, because pistachios, almonds, and walnuts have some good evidence behind them, and they can be added to foods that you enjoy. I actually put together an avocado chocolate mousse, because avocados show good evidence. The nuts are great to add in, and you can make it with dark chocolate. So there's a good one for you.
If you eat that, will it put you in the mood, or do you have to sort of be in the mood and you eat it and it makes you feel more passionate?
Sure. So with all of these things, it's not necessarily that immediate effect like a Tylenol when you have a headache. It's going to be longer term. What made me really write this chapter is that so many individuals struggle with the side effects of selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. So what are other ways we can help them? And so helping them really improve their diet and include these foods, and maybe include them on a night out, or if they're cooking dinner at home, but have awareness of them as they are also cutting back on things which could dampen their sex drive or their libido.
You mentioned about the side effects of the serotonin reuptake inhibitors. It's commonly used for depression, but then it also has a diminishing effect on your libido. I'm a little bit surprised that the percentage of patients that don't respond to the serotonin drugs is about 30%.
It's pretty high.
And if it's that high, what else? Then what are we talking about? Sleep, exercise, meditation?
And nutrition. So there's a bunch of individuals who are suffering out there, and medications are simply not helping them. Access to care is limited. We know we simply are short on prescribers, short on therapists. It becomes a holistic approach. What can you do to boost how you're feeling? Can you use a mindfulness practice? Can you make sure that you're hydrating? I've seen patients present with panic due to dehydration. Can you think about ways that you can build in meditation, movement, dance? Spending time in nature actually helps with mood, lowers anxiety, helps people feel centered. It's not just one organ or one system. It's really about the whole body. But nutrition is a big pillar of that because, like I said, you can't out-supplement a bad diet. You can't out-exercise a bad diet. You can't just say, hey, I'm going to head to the fast food restaurant every day, but I'm going to be exercising and doing a meditation practice. It works all together.
In your life as a physician, did you ever encounter any surprise foods that you found to be either really good for you or bad for you?
I'll tell you that culturally, my grandmother would give me a little drink made with ginger and, say, turmeric and some form of milk when I was a kid if I had a cold. But I loved her dearly, so I would always drink it or eat it or whatever it was. But I didn't really pay attention to it. I didn't think it was serious. I just thought of spices in terms of flavoring food. When I really dipped into the science behind the different spices and what we know about things like rosemary, parsley, Mexican oregano, thyme, and everything out there, I was fascinated to understand that there was so much more behind all of this and the nutrients in food themselves. So that was fun for me.
We talked a little bit about the goals of your book. Did you do it because you think that the medical profession and the lay society needs more education and greater awareness on the importance of food for your brain?
That's a great question because nutritional psychiatry fills this gap in our understanding around the power of food and our brain. And I felt that people needed to know that. It's not just soft science, it's emerging evidence. My book is heavily researched for that reason. Although it's written as a nonfiction trade book, there are over 550 references to show people and guide them through the fact that if they're reading something, there's scientific evidence behind it that they can look up, they can interpret, they can read. As we know as physicians, there can always be an argument made back and forth about any particular fact based on emerging evidence. But I also felt this food as medicine idea and concept needed to be brought forth into the world, and that people needed to understand the power at the end of their fork that they could use to feel better.
Uma, it's been a delightful time sitting here talking with you and gaining a greater understanding in a rather straightforward way about how we can make our brains better. Your book, This Is Your Brain on Food, is well written, easy to read. I recommend it to everybody listening. And besides that, it's a free recipe book. So thank you so much for spending time with us.
Thank you so much, Dr. Stieg. I enjoyed being here and I appreciate it.
This Is Your Brain with Dr. Phil Stieg is produced for the Weill Cornell Brain and Spine Center by the Really Interesting Picture Company. The episode producers are Geraldine Abinader and Hildy Rubin. The series is directed and edited by Tom Beltry, with music by Lenny Williams of Load Bearing Music. The announcer is Allison Power. Please contact us at drphilstieg.com or follow us on Facebook at This Is Your Brain.